Hi everyone, welcome to the first Q&A. Thanks to everyone who posted questions in the Facebook group. I'm going to try and answer those in a detailed yet succinct manner, and let's see how we go. I'm hoping to do one of these Q&As every couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for these in the group, and if you've got any questions then save them up when I make a post saying that I'm doing one, pop them down below and we'll get round to your questions. Okay, so first question that I want to deal with came from Rick, and he asked about progressing exercises in terms of load. Is it better to progress exercises in really small increments, such as by adding 1 or 2 pounds, or in the UK, half a kilo, things like that? Or is it better to go for bigger jumps? There's actually a few possible scenarios here that we can look at. So it depends. I'm afraid I'm going to say that a lot, but yeah, it does depend. So let's look at an example where we're perhaps training for strength, which means that we're usually working in something like the 3 to 6 rep range. Now, that's not to say that going beyond the 6 rep range can't cause strength improvements. It can, but typical strength training involves lots of work in that 3 to 6 rep range. So if you're doing something like a barbell back squat and you're working with sets of 3, then taking that up to working with sets of 4, that's actually quite a big jump in performance. And so adding reps in that case isn't ideal. So that's a great case for adding small amounts of weight. And so going up 1 or 2 kilos on a week by week or month by month basis, depending on how advanced a trainee you are, is going to be a good way of progressing the exercise. So if we're talking about low repetition training and we're dealing with barbells or a leg press or something that's plate loaded, where we can add tiny little increments of weight, then going up in 1 or 2 pound steps is a great idea. However, if you look at something like a dumbbell lateral raise, where we're abducting the arm away from the side of the body, it's not an exercise that I would get a lot of mountain bikers to do, but it's one that a lot of people are familiar with, then you're probably going to look more to a repetition progression, because going up to the next dumbbell in the rack might be going up 2.5 kilos, and you might be going from 10 kilo lateral raises to 12.5 kilo lateral raises, and that could make a huge difference to how many reps you could perform. In which case, you might find that you have to take 10 kilos from performing sets of 8 all the way to performing something like sets of 15 by gradually progressing reps over time, and then you can jump up to the next dumbbell in the rack, 12.5 kilos, and you might have to drop all the way back down to sets of 8 again, and then go for a repetition progression. So if you do make big jumps in weight, what you might find is that you'll have to drop down to the bottom of the rep range that you're working with, and then progress back up through the reps before you can make another big jump. I hope that answers your question, Rick. So Rick had another question, and it was about pre-workout stretching. So from what we've seen in the research, we understand that performing static stretching before a strength training session is not a good idea. And that's because static stretching will cause a short-term impact on the amount of force that you can generate from a muscle. So just to be clear, by static stretching, we mean finding a stretch position and holding that position for 15 seconds to all the way up to like 3 minutes is what can typically be classed as static stretching. This reduces force output from the muscles, and that goes directly against the goal of strength training, where we're looking to maximize force output, and that gives us all of the wonderful adaptations that we're looking for from a strength training session. Now, that reduction in force output does seem to last a few hours, but if you want to stretch and perform strength training on the same day, just make sure that you're separating it out by a decent amount of time. I think 8 hours is a pretty good guideline to aim for. So if you want to wake up in the morning, perform a stretching routine, and then strength train in the evening, then that's totally okay. If you want to stretch before bed and then wake up in the morning and perform a strength training routine, again, I think you're going to be absolutely fine. What we do prefer to do is to perform dynamic stretching, which is where you move in and out of a stretch position and don't hold that stretch position for anything more than like 1 or 2 seconds. That's a perfectly acceptable way to kind of mobilize yourself before a workout, and it's been shown to not negatively impact force output in a strength training session. Now, one little caveat, there can be situations where performing a static stretch can be helpful before a strength training session, and that can be if you're performing some sort of exercise where you're finding that your mobility is limited and you're perhaps unable to get into the necessary positions for that exercise, something like a barbell back squat. And if you're finding that you're tight around certain joints, such as the ankles or the hips, then performing some sort of static stretch that lets you get into that position, that can be a good idea to do that before a strength training workout. And you'll find that as you then start to train that movement with the range of motion that that stretch gives you, you'll find that you'll become less and less reliant on performing that static stretch before the workout to get into that position. What I like to think is strength training is like pressing save on your work that you've done on a computer. So by strength training, your body will then remember that additional mobility that that stretch gave you, and over time you will actually need less of the stretch to be able to get into that position. Just on a side note, if I had to choose between strength training and stretching, I would probably choose strength training over stretching, because it's been shown that strength training improves your mobility to a really similar degree to static stretching, but strength training also makes you stronger, whereas stretching does not. Hope that answers your question, Rick. Okay, so our next question comes from Mike, and he asked about nutrition strategies for like big days out on the bike, and he was talking about a sort of 40 to 50 miler on the South Downs, which is pretty hilly terrain. So if we assume that that's going to be something like 4 to 5 hours of actual pedaling time, then yeah, we're going to have to plan accordingly, because there's going to be a fairly significant calorie burn that comes with that. So I do have an article on my website about ride day nutrition, and if you want something to refer to after this video, then I'll pop a link in the video description below so you can go to that. But if we just think of things that frequently get kind of missed when we're thinking about these really, really big days out on the ride, especially if your typical ride is kind of coming in under 2 hours, then when you're going over that sort of 90-minute, 2-hour barrier, then you can do to have a few sort of extra strategies in place. So if we start first of all by thinking about breakfast, I mean, I would personally go for something that emphasizes a fair amount of carbohydrate. You want to maximize glycogen storage in your body. Glycogen is your body's stored form of carbohydrate, and it's your preferred fuel source for high intensity exercise. And certainly if you're riding at a level where you're breathing quite heavily, then you're going to be preferentially burning carbohydrate over other fuel sources. And that's not to say that you're not burning fat as well, but carbohydrate is going to be the dominant fuel source. So we want to maximize glycogen storage. Unless you're doing something really, really big, I don't think there's a need to kind of carb up the night before. I would eat a normal evening meal. But yeah, eating a fairly carb-rich breakfast is a good idea. And then another thing that you need to think about is hydration. I know that if you're going to be doing a ride like this in the summer, it could be pretty hot. I mean, it's Britain, so it could go either way. And so, you know, you should factor in that you could be consuming anything from 500 milliliters of liquid to a litre per hour of riding. You know, it really does depend on how much climbing is involved, and the weather conditions, but factor that in accordingly, you know, and think about water stops. What you should also do is think about electrolyte intake. I mean, I'm personally a little bit vulnerable to cramping, and so I find that adding those effervescent electrolyte tablets that you can now get at lots of supermarkets, or you can buy from bike shops online, and mixing those into my water according to their instructions. It's usually something like 1 tablet for every 500 milliliters of water, has been amazing for me and has really kept the cramp at bay. In terms of food intake, you've got to think, am I going to be riding over a period of time when I would normally have a meal? And I think you should factor that in as well. So, you know, don't skip meals. But again, if you're traveling with a pack and you're kind of doing this thing independently and you know that you haven't got like places where you can stop and buy food, then yeah, taking things like sandwiches, wraps, food that travels really well is always a good idea. In terms of food intake during the ride, I mean, I find that I can rely on things like cereal bars, you know, trail mix, which is like dried fruit with, you know, dried coconut and some nuts and things in there. Stuff that just travels really well and can stay in your pack and won't go off is a pretty good idea, to be honest. Aiming for something like 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate consumption per hour, again, depending on the intensity of your effort. At higher intensities, it's going to be at the higher end of that carbohydrate consumption. I mean, elite endurance athletes will push as far as 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrate consumption per hour. So it really does depend how hard you are pedaling. And let's have a think, what else could we discuss? Something that I've seen people kind of get wrong before, and it can be pretty unpleasant, is consuming high glycemic index carbohydrates. So things like Lucozade and really, really sugary treats in that kind of, you know, 30 to 40 minute window before setting off on the ride. And that can cause what we call rebound hypoglycemia, which is when basically you do that, you eat some really, really sugary stuff, you get a nice big insulin spike, and that can then actually cause a corresponding drop in blood sugar levels in the early stages of the ride, and you will feel awful. And so certainly before the ride, I would emphasize sort of less refined sources of carbohydrate. So like my breakfast is going to be things like porridge, it's wholemeal toast, fruit, which will then of course contain fiber, which will lessen the glycemic load. And yeah, so up until about 15 minutes before the ride, I would say avoid things like sugary energy drinks and Haribos and Jelly Babies. These can be fantastic during the ride to bring plummeting blood sugar levels back up, in which case the insulin response is just not really worth worrying about. But yeah, having that in the hours before a ride is not such a good idea. I hope that answers that question for you, Mike. Okay, so Mike also had another question about protein, and he was saying that after a workout he'll typically consume a protein shake, but then he gets really, really hungry in an evening and wants to raid the fridge. And is it okay to have another shake? So there's a couple of things I want to address here. First of all, having a protein shake after your workout, nothing wrong with that at all. But I do want to make it clear that there's no such thing really as this kind of post-workout window that used to get discussed, and this idea that you have to consume protein within an hour of your workout, otherwise you might as well have not trained at all. The research has shown us that muscle protein synthesis, which is your body basically manufacturing muscle proteins as part of the recovery process, that remains elevated in the body for something like 72 hours.
So muscle protein synthesis actually stays elevated for more like 24 to 36 hours, not the 72 like this complete idiot has just said.
after a strength training session. So it's not so much a post-workout window, more of a post-workout barn door. And it's also been shown that instead of post-workout protein, it's much more daily protein intake that seems to be the factor that most closely correlates to things like muscle gain after a strength training session. So what I would say is, do you have an idea where your total daily protein numbers are at? There's probably nothing wrong with having another protein shake. I think protein shakes are fine as long as you're not completely relying on them for all your daily protein. So if you're able to use something like a food tracker like MyFitnessPal or Chronometer, which is another app that you can look at, you should be thinking about getting your protein intake if you're training hard or you're wanting to make improvements to body composition, up around 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight. So if you're an 80 kilogram rider, then getting your protein intake up to 120 grams and maybe going as high as 160 grams is a perfectly good idea, and it can really help with appetite control as well as improve your recovery. It helps with appetite control because protein is a really satiating macronutrient, and which means eating a lot of protein can make you feel really full and can just really blunt any cravings. So I would say nothing necessarily wrong with having an additional protein shake, because as long as you're not becoming overly reliant on them. And I would start to take a look at your total daily protein intake and see where that lies. I hope that helps, Mike, and answers your question. Okay, so our last question comes from Peter, who was asking, is there a way that he can kind of stop his reliance on sugary snacks? And he felt that he had a kind of unhealthy sugary snacking habit in place. So there's quite a lot to unpack here. It's quite an in-depth question, which is why I've left it till last. So first thing I want to get out of the way, if you're a really active individual and you're putting in a lot of miles on the bikes, then eating a fair few sugary snacks, there could be worse things that you could be doing. Especially if you're maintaining a stable weight, then you certainly need the calories that are coming from those snacks. So if you're reaching for sugary snacks quite often, but you're maintaining a weight of, let's say, 80 kilograms all the time, and you're fairly happy with your body composition, then you certainly need those calories. What I would say is that the sugary snacks could be displacing other nutritious food out of your diet, and it would be a good idea for kind of longevity, long-term health, to look at ways that we can kind of replace those sugary snacks with food choices that might feed into more sort of long-term goals of longevity and riding your bikes lots in the future, into old age. I would also say, lots of sugary snacks, it's not great for dental health as well. This is something that kind of does get overlooked sometimes. Everyone seems to be focused on kind of fat loss or weight gain and things like that, but it does need mentioning. So what you should think about is, why are you reaching for those sugary snacks? So in my experience, there can be a few reasons as to why people reach for the sugary snacks in the cupboards. One can be kind of emotional eating. I know from my experience that under times of like high stress at work, I find myself wanting those kind of foods more. I feel my fingers get restless and I find myself wandering into the kitchen thinking, where are those treats? And I've kind of become aware of that, and by becoming aware of that, I'm able to kind of put strategies in place that can help me resist those snacks. I also find being sleep deprived means that I'm much more likely to reach for those foods, and so if I'm able to get my sleep on point by going to bed a little bit earlier, getting off the phone or away from a screen a little bit sooner of an evening, then I will wake up feeling more refreshed, and I just find it so much easier to manage cravings. I literally experience fewer cravings for these kinds of foods. Other ones can be basically lack of planning, lack of preparation. Are they being reached for because you're hungry and actually that's all that there is to eat? And in which case you need to have a think about what else can you put in your cupboards that would be more filling and perhaps have like lower calorie density, and have a higher kind of nutrient content, you know, maybe snacks that have got more protein and just more micronutrients as well in there. So if you're able to identify what is your trigger for going for these sugary snacks, and then kind of trace the steps back and address the sort of sequence of events that kind of leads to you reaching for the sugary snacks in the cupboard, and you want to stop that being a habit, then that's the way to do it. Identify what your motivations are for when you do it, and then work back through the sequence of thoughts that leads to you going for that sugary snack, and focus on the things that you can change. So, such as when you sit down and you do the shopping list, then, you know, doing that at a time when willpower is high, then you can make choices on the shopping list that will anticipate you experiencing those cravings or emotional eating cues in the future, and you can nip those in the bud right there, because ultimately if less of that food is in the house, then you're less likely to reach for it as well. I hope that goes some way to answering your question, Peter. I think it's quite a long and detailed one, and certainly I feel like there are a lot more other things to explore, and if you want me to go into more detail, I'm only too happy to. Okay folks, thanks very much if you tuned in to this, and I hope that you gleaned some useful information from this Q&A. If you've got a question in the future, then yeah, join the Facebook group. I'll put a link in the description below if you want to join the Facebook group, and you can ask questions for these in the future. And also consider checking out my website at www.endlesstrailfitness.co.uk. And it would be a huge help to me if you would consider clicking on the link that says newsletter or subscribe, and signing up for my newsletter, which comes out monthly, so it will not completely spam your inbox.